up, we have consensus by coercion, green extractivisms and non-violent forms of reproduction of the imperial mode living in the Chilean, Mexican and Peruvian mining sector, with Lorena Olarte from University of Vienna, Anna Preiser also from University of Vienna, and Nina Schlosser from University of Vienna and the Berliner School of Economics and Law. Following that, we've got Enforcing Green Extractivism, Social Warfare and the Making of the Critical Raw Material Frontier in Portugal, with Xander Dunlap from University of Oslo, Mariana Riquito from University of Coimbra. Then we have our third paper, Infrastructures of Enforcement, Wind Forms and Stratified Violence in Wallmapu, Chile, with Maria Cariola from University of Copenhagen. Then finally, we have Dark Sides of Sustainability, Exploring Global Uneven Development and Future Geopolitical Tensions from Hans Warnecke-Berger from University of Kassel and Luíza Cerioli from University of Kassel. Also, I hope I've done all right on my pronunciation there for everyone. Apologies if not. So let's go straight into the first paper and I'll hand over to Lorena, Anna and Nina.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Joanna, and also thank you very much for all the interesting previous presentations today. And it was a pleasure to listen to all of them. So Nina and we are very happy to give you a very brief introduction to our topic, the key concept and also the cases we refer to in the paper we are currently working on, and to present some similarities and also specifics of those cases. And our colleague Lorena Olarte will also be happy to answer some questions also later on. So yeah, due to the centrality of some metals, so-called energy transition metals, such as lithium, copper, and silver, which are used as a material base for climate change mitigation strategies. And we want to contribute to the discussion of green extractivism, or rather the greening of extractivism, considering it as an ongoing process of institutionalization, contestation, discourses, and practices. And by analyzing those aspects and also processes of greening in the mining sectors of Chile, Mexico, and Peru, which are all important metal exporting countries on a world scale. And this process recently is also being accompanied by the concept of greening mining, pushed by international actors, and is presented as a new mining vision in the context of climate change, capable of overcoming mining's negative image, legitimizing mining as being environmentally sustainable, creating social benefits, social inclusion, also acceptance, and also by contributing to green economic growth. And yeah, we connect this to the concept of the imperial mode of living, which is very resource and emission intensive. The concept connects the everyday with structures and also emphasizes that this mode of living is based on the externalization of social and ecological costs in space and time. So it goes along with the exploitation of labor, nature, and also, to put it a bit more broadly, with the exploitation and destruction of territories elsewhere. It is also based on the internalization of those costs also within Latin American countries. And there it is secured also by certain structures such as the international, also national territorial division of labor, and also societal hierarchies. And we argue that the extraction of transition metals, a greening of extractivism, and also the imperial mode of living mutually reproduce each other and also legitimate ongoing unsustainable and exploitative patterns of capitalist development. And yes, so I said initially, we refer to Chile, Mexico, and Peru, and there shed light on certain discourses and practices of some main actors, and mainly the states, companies, and local communities, on eco-territorial conflicts and different forms of institutionalization, both on the national and the local level. And our research is based on field research in those countries, conducting, amongst others, semi-structured interviews and participant observation, both also on a national and local level. And also we do document analysis. And yeah, so for the case of Chile, Nina focuses on the hegemonic and counter-hegemonic collective actors within the lithium sector, and also by which discursive practices they compete for or against a lithium consensus. She deals with the institutionalization of lithium mining and also on the transformation of conflicts with a focus on the Salar de Atacama to the point of an active or passive consensus through cultural safeguarding. And there she highlights also why conflicts not only result between the extractivist state, lithium producers, and the affected local communities, but also within those communities, and there, in this case, in particular between indigenous and also non-indigenous people. Regarding Mexico, Lorena examines distinctions in the greening of extractivisms by tracing some historical and socio-economic aspects that lie outside the common path towards intensive extraction in comparison to other Latin American countries. And Lorena finds similar continuities of the extractivist common sense, despite Mexico's legal environmental framework being a pioneer, considering, for example, its climate change laws, which then contrast with loose regulation. And in the study of the Sierra Norte in her home state, Puebla, she found successful practices that have deterred projects relating to mining and extractivism in general, yet renewed discursive strategies by private interests and authorities illustrate the expansion of the extractive offensive which is happening. And for the case of Peru, I focus on the institutionalization of environmental regulation in the mining sector, which is used as a discursive and also legal legitimation by governmental actors and also companies to advance mining. And there I highlight the case of resistance against the mine Tia Maria by a substantial part of the local population who defend their territory and agricultural practice and profoundly distrust those environmental institutions which have been developing and also distrust promises of sustainable development. And this case reflects limits of environmental politics, considering democratic, social, and also territorial aspects, which are also likely or being reproduced within greening extractivism. And now we'll pass over to Nina, who will present some highlights about our findings.
Yeah, thank you, Anna and Laura, and of course, everybody. In light of what Anna just said, and during the analysis of the 3 empirical cases, we recognize similarities, but also noteworthy specifics. The hegemonic discourses are quite similar. The ruling forces reactivate these well-known development discourse and extend it by a sustainability nexus, and hence relate now to sustainable development and to a certain extent to climate change. And against this backdrop, green mining would merely be possible due to scientific knowledge and the use of modern technologies. Counter-hegemonic discourses, on the other hand, refer to green extractivism, green mining, and the resulting green costs, which especially human and nature are forced to bear. In Peru, the hegemonic discourse lies exactly on modern and sustainable mining, and thereby is contrasted to the highly contaminating, gray, old, and illegal mining. But in Chile, the corporate discourses feature a stronger focus on the cultural facet. And I mean, in reference to the reconstruction, the conservation of traditional indigenous knowledges. And Mexico, again, it draws its attention to its own sovereignty. The state discourse shows a nationalist turn, discussing the nationalization of metals such as lithium, and just like the new and still extractivist state in Chile. And these narratives materialize into practices and are applied to legitimize or rather delegitimize the greening of mining. Corporate practices include sustainable development projects in areas such as education, health, culture, in relation to the environment and water, and mining companies transfer, in parts, immense amounts of capital, of money to the state in the form of royalties or as compensation to communities. And one might also observe the criminalization of protesters and environmental defenders. But especially at the local sphere, the parts of the affected, actually quite heterogeneous communities resist by dint of roadblocks, hunger strikes, and even lawsuits against the mining companies. But nonetheless, national, transnational mining companies, at least in Peru and Chile, seem to be able to put sustainable mining on the political agenda. And we are wondering, how is that possible? But based on the two findings of the cases Chile and Peru, we could say that political elites act in collusion with the economic elites and do quite politics behind closed doors. And in Mexico, I mean, in turn, the measures build a commodity consensus, to build a commodity consensus, to use the term coined by Maristela Swampa. These measures are less vague. In fact, authoritarian practices, even armed force, are executed by criminal organizations to persuade of extractivist projects. And these growing tensions within the mining sector unfold in eco-territorial conflicts. This is because mining, as it may green or not, it creates various impacts at local level, and consequently, these conflicts increase in number and intensity when expanding these extractivist frontiers. But depending on the respective context, these forms of and reasons for conflicts, they vary. And I would like to underpin this hypothesis with our finding from the empirical cases. This mining project, this mega mining project in the Salar Atacama, perhaps the first or the next sacrifice zone in Chile, until the signing of the new agreements in 2016 and 18, there have been manifest conflicts between the companies and the communities. But since then, these conflicts are more latent and also increased, but within the communities, and just separated indigenous and non-indigenous people. In Mexico, in contrast, still persists a strong local opposition to mining projects with some important successes so far. They took steps towards the unconstitutionality of the mining law. But in Peru exists only a few emblematic cases of successful resistance, even after, I mean, Tia Maria, even after 12 years of fighting against it, the local population could not reach yet the cancellation of the project. And despite all these green costs, I mean, the degradation of land, territories, the commodification of nature, violation of human rights of Pachamama, and I mean, I could just expand this list for more minutes, but despite all these costs, these sustainable mining projects are finally legitimized by their institutionalization. And the national and international structures seem to allow for the more or less unhindered greening of mining, whereby the institutional framework mainly already exists, and just like Alexander said it, and other people here, just it gets a green coat of paint. And there is yet an ongoing process of the implementation of mining, of environmental laws, the conclusion of new contracts between the state and the companies, but also between...
You know, just 2 minutes left.
Thank you, I just conclude. There are also contracts with the communities. And in light of our preliminary research findings, we conclude thus far that despite of the increasing tensions and conflicts in nature and culture-rich countries, the greening of extractivism is supported by dominant discourses and practices, which seem to legitimize the further expansion of mining. And on the other hand, there are these culturally and institutionalized conflicts inscribed in structures. And once anchored in this extractivist common sense, to speak with Eduardo Godinez, it also facilitates the reproduction and expansion of the imperial mode of living, in fact, in the global north and south. And however, a commodity consensus is not carved in stone, and it always remains contested, and in fact with global implications. And this is what we try to understand. And we just hope we could share some insights. And thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you. Some wonderful insights there into discursive strategies used by extractivists here. So we'll move on now to Sander and Mariana, please. Oh, can't hear you there.
But yeah, here's the title. I read it to you on mute. And ultimately that landscape back there is going to more or less be obliterated by what is supposed to be one of the largest lithium mines in Europe, which is in its making. And we'll talk about that with you today. And now it doesn't want to, there we go. So yeah, here's the outline. Let's not waste time on it and just get to it. But ultimately, climate change mitigation and the European Green Deal, yeah, let's electrify, let's get green, let's just continue what we're doing, and if not, make new markets, ooh la la, bikes, let's get electric vehicles, let's be really smart, more mineral intensity, all the way. Very tired of this stuff. Here's some fun statistics about how ridiculous all these predictions are and what's gonna be there. Guess what? Norway has already surpassed previous predictions of how many electric vehicles they'll have, which are insanely material intensive. And of course, we're talking about electric vehicles, but we could also talk about smartphones and every other type of television screen electronic, because lithium is a key ingredient behind it for lithium-ion batteries. Let's not waste time. Yes, the fun metaphor, the new gold. Thanks, Mariana, for getting this picture. Yeah, so maybe what's going to hopefully be a more relevant and fun conversation, and I really appreciate people kind of calling this term out so we can get into it a bit more, is, so I'm going to try to read more off of here. So why not infrastructural violence? And I think the short answer is because it's more than just it's violence, of course, but it completely is reshaping and restructuring entire regions. And this means, and it's also trying to draw, not only explicitly politicize what's going on, but it's also making continuity, that the same type of infrastructures are being deployed and spread all over the world, whether they're mines, different walls, you name it, police, military infrastructures. And in this case, we're talking about a lithium mine that's going to eradicate this kind of rural peripheral area in Portugal. And that's the thing. A lot of this is, I think at the bottom of this is to really think about how not everyone knows the struggles and lives of being under Israeli occupation or even Native North America. But so for people's lives, they feel that they're being taken over, absorbed, displaced, sacrificed, and things like this. But really it's to kind of establish a line in continuity to make sense of how humans are more or less destroying the world through their infrastructures and their minds. And you can see this very clearly from airplanes when you look down. And so this is also to stress that there's an entire apparatus going on there, you know, in terms of employing people for coercion, deception, but there's also the positive features of opportunity, which is really to stress the importance of colonial collaboration and different structures or leaders that are often selling out their people in these areas, or even the people who've been isolated from communities who want to go work for the company and be entrepreneurs and things like this. But this is, to use this term, is to really stress the literal interpretation of how a landscape is being domesticated, broken, and taken over, which in terms land acquisition, ecological degradation, infrastructure as a weapon, high walls, or how they're actually going to move things in if there is resistance, and actually manage a population where they're actually divided and maybe they're going to bring in, there's a micro settler colonial dynamic in terms of they're going to be bringing skilled workers in. They're going to be importing different people into these areas. And I've looked at this in France, but also in Oaxaca, Mexico, with different indigenous groups and how they were decimated through dam infrastructures and then wind turbines and things like this. Conflict, reconfiguration of social relationships. So there's which we'll talk about more, is the infiltration of social fabrics to kind of break and fragment different social bonds. But to really not waste too much time on this, and hopefully we can get more into this topic, into the Q&A, is that really the infrastructure is an apparatus. It's not just violence. It's a systemic and continuing thing. They're creating an entire network and trying to include people in it and get people to believe in it. So there's a psychosocial aspect of marketing and kind of engineering of people's psychologies. And yes, this ultimately relates to kind of the aspect of social war, of actually how you can actually engage and intervene into people's psychologies, mentalities, and social bonds in favor of capital accumulation in different companies and things like this. But again, I hope we can get to this a bit more. So yeah, and part of this is also a reaction to kind of sacrifice zones, where sacrifice zones is a way to say, oh, it's discarded, we're gonna crush them. But it's a bit more. There's a whole apparatus there. There's actually people who are collaborating with it, different politicians and different people. So they need to set up kind of a structure to kind of make these projects happen, which isn't, sure, in one sense it's being the periphery is being sacrificed, but I want to stress that it's a bit more, and there's complicated relations in how these projects are pulled off. So let's turn it over to Mariana to get into this.
Yes, thank you, Xander. And as he mentioned, all this green landscape that you see here, it's in the northern Portugal, and this is where Savannah Resources, a British multinational, wants to open what would be the EU's largest open pit lithium mine. We're going to go over to the next slide just before explaining the project and really explaining how the company is engineering this social acceptance of extractivism. I will give you a brief context and profile of the town. You can go over, Xander.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. So really, Covers do Barroso, this small village, is located in a natural park, one of the oldest natural parks in Portugal. It is an agricultural village. It is dominated by livestock production. It is famous for its honey and its beef, but there's also small holdings of goat, sheep, pig, and it's really, livestock production is really central to these towns' rural subsistence economy, which is characterized by very low energy uses, low consumption levels, very few surpluses, especially when compared to the rest of Portugal and to actually other European regions. Another important characteristic of this town's identity is that it virtually to this day preserves traditional and ancestral ways of working the land and treating livestock, and that is why in 2017 FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has classified this village as World Agricultural Heritage, recognizing the importance of these ancestral methods and the way people live in symbiosis with nature, but also recognizing the communitarianism intrinsic to this town, where the land is communally owned and managed, and where even the water distribution is communally shared. But we can go over to the next slide. This communal culture is under attack. The British multinational Savannah Resources aims to build here what would be the EU's largest open pit mine, as we've already said. As you can see on this map, this is taken from the company's website. Their project is to open 4 large open pit mines, and on top of that, all the infrastructure that is required to sustain this open pit mine, so the tailing dams and other infrastructures, in a total area of the total area of 542 hectares. But the company has already applied for an extension, which would grant the company almost 600 hectares to explore. And we can go over to the next slide. Over the past 5 years, ever since the locals have heard about the intentions of this company and the intentions of the state to create this mine, there has been resistance, the creation of local anti-mining associations, there has been blockades of state authorities, also marches, demonstration, protests across the country. We can go on and to the next slide. But really what, as Xander was saying, and what we'll really be focusing on in this presentation, and this really builds upon all the previous presentations that we've had today, speaking about social engineering of extraction, social license to operate, is really how this particular company, but in cooperation with state authorities, in cooperation with European Union authorities, more or less direct cooperation, in cooperation with the academic complex, the media complex, the financial complex in Portugal, is really engineering the social acceptance of extraction. Our work, we have conducted ethnographic field work together this year, and both me and Xander have been sort of somewhat active participants in this conflict for the past year. Xander has spoken in the European Parliament already about this. And really here what you see, this SLO, which talked about a lot today, is all, and what we will be focusing on today is what are the efforts that this company is doing in this region, in this particular small town, to really manufacture consent, pacify the resistance, and this is what we want to stress, and has all the other presentations have also stressed, is all the politics that are doing in cooperation with local authorities, with the Portuguese state, the Portuguese government, and also with EU-funded projects such as the MIRU, which stands for Mining and Metallurgy Regions of the EU, and whose aim is precisely to create these guidelines for the social license to operate at the EU level. And we can go over to the next slide. And before going back to Xander, really the first effort that we can see that has been going on in Portugal, but this is really a mining textbook elsewhere, as we've seen from the previous presentation, is how the mining company makes use of very bureaucratic facades that gives them credibility, but actually work just as a way of creating a legal facade, but in reality, it doesn't allow for active and public participation of citizens. And in the case of this open pit mine, this contract has actually been signed between the Portuguese state and Savannah Resources without any prior consultation to the local authorities or to the local population. And this is why a lawsuit is now filed against the Portuguese state. On top of that, the Portuguese Environmental Agency is currently under investigation by the Hours Convention. As you might know, this is the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation, and on Environmental Matters. And at issue is the fact that the Portuguese Environmental Agency has denied repeatedly to disclose information regarding the environmental impact assessment, which was actually done without having authorization to the field. So the company, which is not a mining company, has written this environmental impact assessment, which is still under evaluation, without having a mining record and without having access to the field. So there's really all these bureaucratic mechanisms really are very questionable or even under investigation, and really just show how there's they function to actively exclude communities and to actively ridicule communities who are struggling. And we can go over to the next slide. And
just 2 more minutes, sorry.
Okay, yeah, and just very quickly, this is also what's been going on in this small town, also very textbook. There's a permanent info point you can see here on the photo. There's very recently, there's a video surveillance cameras 24/7 in this public space. Every trimester, there's newsletters which are handed out telling the good deeds that the company's been doing. We've witnessed media control, local media control, but also national media control. And yeah, Xander, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, we don't have much time. But it's actually, so this is the lowest intensity conflict I've ever seen or witnessed and worked in. But what was mind-boggling is actually the way that the companies have really strategically moved in to find strategic families and people that would work with them. So literally going after more vulnerable people and families, trying to kind of include them and get them going in there. And this means influential families, really land contracting, reminding or threatening people that, you know, if they don't sell, the state's going to expropriate it from them, offering to buy land at much higher than market value, using lease format, trying to present it as a win-win, like, okay, if you sell with us now and the Portuguese government doesn't approve, then you can like keep your land and get the money. So they're using every type of typical land tactic that there is out there. Yeah, we're going to just keep it short, but the way that people, importantly, the way people relate to this is that, you know, they're not helping us, and we can go on for this for hours, but they're not helping them. That Savannah, anything that they do is actually really just to try to buy them and put them in their pockets. And that people are just, you know, people are in spades, which, you know, is their traditional kind of spade with each other. This is just war. It's just war. So they see really their life ways being displaced, and they're going to be pushed out of there. But so kind of the main thing is that we are witnessing a process of kind of green grabbing to establish roughly a 15-year site of green extractivism. You know, green grabbing extractivism requires institutional, economic, and financial support. This necessitates a process of social war in terms of really infiltrating and waging kind of an attack on people's social values and their relationships. This is, you know, justified land defense can give way to violent state repression and company repression. So ultimately people are organizing, and if they escalate and they try to push this through, there's going to be a much bigger mess and struggle there. And again, this is just to stress that liberal approaches like consultas públicas and things like this are part of the social engineering of extraction and aren't really there for real democratic deliberation, because there's so much other stuff going on the side. So I think we're about out of time. Let's end it there, and thanks everyone.
Thanks very much, Sandra and Mariana, for the fascinating presentation. More insights there with bureaucratic violence and this exploitation of vulnerable families. Let's move on to Maria Cariola, and your paper, please, Maria.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for having organized this. I hope, can you see me well? I had a technical problem with my computer, so I'm on my iPhone, but everything's good, right?
I could see you, then you disappeared, but I can see you again now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. I had PowerPoint slides, but we will have to go to go old school here, because I don't have access to my PowerPoint slides. So I'm a PhD student in political ecology at the University of Copenhagen. And in my project, I am very generally trying to interrogate what it means that multinational joint stock companies are protagonizing the Chilean energy transition. So I'm working in Chile, and I am doing so by looking into a series of cases of wind farm projects on indigenous land in the province of Malleco. Now I would have liked to show you a map, of course, which is the heartland of the Mapuche people. So I'm thinking about corporations as essentially fundamentally dependent on legal techniques. And I'm trying to think about what happens to these fundamentally legal creatures when they enter a frontier space, such as Wallmapu, where low intensity and sometimes not a high intensity, but a quite intense conflict is ongoing over land, and the relationship between property and land is continuously called into question. So I am still doing my fieldwork. I've been in Chile for now 9 months, and today I want to share with you some preliminary results, present the cases, but share with you some of the preliminary results of one of the lines of my investigation, which interrogates the enforcement aspects of corporate rights around these generation sites. So I'm going to provide a little bit of historical context, and then I'm going to present this idea of infrastructures of enforcement through the description of one of the cases. So what do I mean when I say that Wallmapu is a frontier space? Wallmapu was, as I said, the ancestral territory, or is the ancestral territory of the Mapuche people, was one of the last sovereign indigenous territories to be allocated by a state in the Americas, roughly 150 years ago. And since especially the 1990s, there has been the 1990s, an autonomous Mapuche movement have emerged, which has sometimes in addition to sometimes replacing altogether institutional strategies of land recovery. So the autonomous Mapuche movement will utilize direct actions, strategies of land recoveries, of territorial control. And this movement have been accompanied, or the response from above, from both corporations and states, have been a quite intense militarization of Wallmapu. So you have, for instance, today, well, in the commune where I work, you have an installed capacity of more than 1,000 special forces. It's a quite small commune where I work. And as we speak, a regional state of exception has been declared, which has soldiers guarding vital infrastructure and so on. So in these zones, wind energy and renewable energies in general is quite a new phenomenon, as it is in the rest of Chile. But the particularities of the penetration of these projects into these territories is that that companies and wind energy, renewable energy, is situated as somehow a means of stalling conflict. So you have this, what Gersa calls a ruptural vision of renewable energy, in which renewable energy is seen as inherently more democratic, right? So in this context, it means that companies are already disembedding themselves, or sort of distancing themselves from the militarized conflict around the land to which they claim right, by saying that they will be providing peace through development. And so when we look into what actually happens with these projects, there is specifically one large-scale wind farm, the Mayeco wind farm, which I will focus on today because it's the largest project, but also it is the only one that has actually entered into construction. Did I just disappear there?
Can see you.
Can you see me? Okay, that's
Yeah.
great. Is that projects at the construction, which initiated in 2019, rather than stalling old conflict, has started new ones, right? So you had quite early on already sabotage actions happening against the construction site, and you had a quite intense militarization in which more than 200 private security guards were working at the height of construction, alongside with both police and military agents from the state. And this all to get together, along with sort of a securitization, a territorial securitization of the site, in which fencing practices and checkpoints were installed. So I'm trying to think about what happened with this space of the, sorry, just not charging. I'm trying to think about what happened with this space as a sort of production of a hyper enforced space, a space in which the property rights of the corporation were, as it were, enforced to a larger degree than in the surrounding spaces. And I'm trying to ask empirically what it was that allowed for the production of that hyper enforced space. So I'm thinking very much in terms of I'm thinking very much along the lines of Sanders' work, but also of the recent work of other scholars who are trying to think about soft technologies of corporate control, along with more harder technologies or more repressive technologies. And although I don't have so much time, I think that there are principally three different agencies that work together to create this sort of space, all of them having different relationships with the corporation. So you have mitigation agreements with surrounding communities. You have, which includes access for locals to jobs as private security guards, but also which includes a series of conditionalities, which has the success of the construction of the project, or the payment of the money from the company to the communities, depend on the successful construction of the project. So an indirect incentive to actually expulse other communities who are trying to recover the land, which has happened several times. Then you have private security corporations, which in this case are local and also utilize local community members, but do not have the faculty of actually utilizing very much force, but who does have a direct relationship to the last agent of security, which is of course police and military, in short, the apparatus of public force that has the faculty of utilizing lethal violence. There has been 3 people killed until now in relation to the construction of the Mayeco wind farm. And I'm trying to think about this in terms of infrastructures, in the sense that infrastructures, following scholars such as Brian Larkins, are arrangements that are at once indispensable for the operation of something, but simultaneously invisible, right? Or invisibilized in and of themselves, only visible in terms of the objects whose flow they they make possible. So I'm thinking about infrastructures of enforcement in this case, because by thinking about how it is that the responsibility for the militarized enforcement of the property rights of the corporations somehow becomes less clear when other agencies or more indirect when it is the state agencies that carries it forth. My argument is that these three different forces work together. The community security arrangements, the private security guards, and the public police force. They are codependent, but they are imbricated in such a way that the company will not have to assume responsibility for the direct employment of violence in the enforcement of their property rights. So I think that there is many more things that we could say about this. I think that this case dialogues quite well with some of the other presentations, but I will just leave it at that, and then hope that that we can sort of get a bit more into the details in the discussion afterwards.
Thanks very much, Maria. Fascinating. This idea of peace through development through the company, really shocking. And so finally, can we move on to Hans and Luíza, please?
So can everybody see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my ideas, or our ideas. Unfortunately, Luíza can't be here because of some health issues, so I will present this presentation alone. It's called The Dark Side of Sustainability, Exploring Global Uneven Development and Future Geopolitical Tensions. And actually, this is a preliminary outcome of a yet ongoing research project on the dark side of sustainability, which I'm coordinating with my team at the University of Kassel and the University of Marburg. And I want to introduce, first of all, some basic core ideas on the project, and then come to the geopolitical outcome of this idea. First of all, of course, extractivism is not something new. It today affects preliminarily the South, but it is a very, very old configuration. And within the project, we are not so much focusing on extractivist activities and extraction of raw materials on the ground, but we are much more focused on extractivism as a way of ordering entire societies. This is why we are also interested in the history of extractivism. And what we can see is that this map here has emerged in the late 19th century and essentially remained intact until today. We are exactly researching how that global picture will affect also the future world, given a post-energy transition, given the energy transition is taking place, and looking forward to how that picture will affect the post-energy transition world. There sustainability comes in, and what we have recognized during the conference, but also looking, of course, into the literature, sustainability still is a very flat concept, and it has emerged and is still embedded in this uneven world. So we need to rethink the processes of uneven global development. And this is exactly what we are doing, giving the term that we are looking at the dark side of sustainability, also criticizing this notion of sustainability being flat. What we want to add is, first of all, that we are coming from political economy perspective, but we want also to look at geopolitics and international relations. And we think that this dark side of sustainability will not only condition the dynamics of the future world of international negotiations of trade and conflicts, but also will give a much more profound research field within the subdisciplines of social sciences such as geopolitics, IR, and political economy. So what we are doing is looking, first of all, at the processes of global uneven development. And we think that extractivism is one expression, but only one expression of these processes. In our approach, we handle global uneven development by essentially looking at three different levels. At the global uneven diffusion of technology, which essentially leads to global technology gaps. So some countries leading the development of technologies, other countries and economies applying technology without developing it. But also we need to look at the labor market and especially structural unemployment. And there we can see that essentially the global south is still hit by structural unemployment. And this is a global process of inequality. And both together necessarily, both historically and in the current world economy, leads to the persistence of economic rents. And this is core to understand, because we think that extractivism is, as a principle of ordering societies, is just an expression of those three processes. And this leads to two effects. First of all, these three processes leads to a pattern which we call unequal specialization, and it leads to a very different future structure of the international system. We understand social unequal specialization as a configuration in which economic rents incentivize the specialization in product groups that internationally generate very high revenues. So it's lucrative for many societies to export raw materials, but also it creates domestically a lot of problems, but both at the same time. So it generates money and it creates problems. But in a more dynamic vision, unequal specialization hinders sectoral change and reinforces rents. So there are incentives to again and again and again reproduce this pattern on the domestic level, and this will lead to something we call a development trap, because historically there have only minor cases that eventually escape from extractivism and became then non-extractivist economies. So we are looking at the global picture, how that international division of labor incentivize the domestic rearrangement of sectors. What we can argue from this theoretical perspective, and what we are looking at in our project, is that the global energy transition, which is mainly related to the discourse of sustainability, embodies, of course, all these three levels. It handles and will not overcome a global technology gap, because technology is sustainable. Technology is globally not free, of course not. It is related to emergent monopolies at the global level. So some countries and some enterprises do have access to most modern technology, some do not have. But also, third, from new technologies related to sustainability, there is only minor effects on the labor market. So it will then again incentivize this unequal pattern of specialization in which the global south is locked. But also it will lead to a further fragmentation within the global south that many will lose, but of course some economies are able to win. And there are a couple of countries we're looking at which managed to overcome this pattern. What we think that we need to look at not only on the domestic side and not only on the local level, but bringing back into global asymmetries and bringing back into the discussion the structure and the global asymmetries within the international system. And this brings us to the international system logic. What we see in the Ukraine crisis, I think, is the most prominent recent example that we are observing a fundamental shift within the global economy. We are much more becoming multipolar, and this eventually leads, and some facts already signal that process, that we will have to deal with a much more regionalized global economy in the future, in which patterns of asymmetry are deepened but also fragmented. And there are a couple of big players organizing their economies and organizing also the access to raw materials, which will, on the counterpart, also lead to immense fragmentations within the global south. That we can no longer talk about this big difference between north and south, but many north and many south at the same time. So we will see more countries being specialized in raw materials, and many countries not being able to overcome this pattern. This will lead to some future geopolitical constellations, which are important to note. And I think what we can observe and are already observing today, that there's many new types of interconnections developing, but we need to note that these interconnections are not necessarily territorialized, which means that the access to different sites of extractions are not necessarily dependent on big empires or whatever, but on very, very, very specific territories in which big powers can organize their interventions. This will eventually empower a couple of countries, transit countries, but not necessarily the entire global south. And what we already can observe, of course, is that we have to deal with the demise of these traditional oil and gas exporting countries, in which domestically this demise will create future problems, because rents will eventually lose its impact. But at the same time, we will see a new green extractivism. About this conference is a clear issue arguing for that. But the logic behind both issues remain essentially the same. And this is our point. We need to focus on the processes behind the logics of extractivism to understand the political room of maneuver of these countries in both dealing with social change within countries, but also dealing with social change at the international level. What we, I think, can argue for is that given the fact that we are dealing with a multipolar international system, and given the fact that we are dealing with a never-ending global economic asymmetry, there will be a future stalemate between great powers in which the poor, both domestically but also internationally, will lose influence. And this is something which we think should come to the agenda, because 25% of the world population will be excluded from this picture, not taking place in neither sustainability processes, negotiations, or in the processes of domestic change. We think we need to bring back global asymmetries and the international division of labor, but also the structure of the international system back to the agenda, to carefully look at not only extraction sites, but also on the way of societies deal with extractivism and order societies depending on this global flows and controls. Thank you very much.